So you want to talk about sex, huh? You little deviant. Well, I think I got some time on my hands. Let's chat. Who wants to get Sexual education is a necessary component of getting older, but the way sex ed is taught today just leaves so much to be desired. I mean, where's the inclusion? We should rethink U.S. sexual education to be more inclusive of other sexualities and to highlight other forms of pleasure outside of PIV sex. I think this education would help young people become more knowledgeable when they walk into sexual encounters. And also, hopefully it'll encourage them to seek out forms of pleasure to find the most pleasurable sex for them outside of what is considered the standardized sexual encounter. In this video, I will discuss the influence of heteronormativity on sexual norms, the underrepresentation of women's pleasure in sex ed, and the way that limited sexual education can influence and negatively impact one's sexual experiences. First, let's discuss heteronormativity and sexual norms. Heteronormativity impedes on sexual norms by reinforcing the gender binary. Heteronormativity tells us that the main way of having sex is heterosexual cisgender PIV sex. The use of this sexual standard invalidates and ignores the experiences of people with diverse sexualities and gender identities. I propose that sexual education includes a unit on sexuality and gender. This unit would include an examination of how gender influences sex, and it would seek to normalize sex for people outside of the gender binary. This unit would also educate on the different ways you can have sex outside of penetration to challenge sexual scripts that say sex must happen one way. And if it's not that type of sex, then it must not be sex at all. Harvey, Jones, and Kopolsky state, because of the way sexual education is currently taught, people change their own behavior based on their partner's gender and follow strong gendered scripts. These scripts rely heavily on heteronormativity and cis-normative roles. By not teaching young people about how sexuality and gender are incorporated in sex, people fall into upholding these exclusive normative ideals of sex, which invalidate others' experiences and encourage transphobia and homophobia. Second, let's look at the underrepresentation of pleasure in sexual education. Kopsel argues that including pleasure in sex ed may address many axes of inequality and enhance classroom experiences for diverse adolescents. They add that public health researchers and feminist scholars suggest that pleasure-inclusive sex ed is effective for reducing pregnancy, rates of HIV and STIs, and may create a more inclusive classroom environment to underserved individuals. Pleasure-based sex needs to be a part of sex ed curriculums. This unit would not be focused on PIV intercourse. It would discuss non-normative genitalia pleasure to give young people the education needed for them to have the most pleasurable and enjoyable sex. As Kopsel put it, this could be vital in creating a more inclusive environment to talk about sex and fight against oppressive structures of power that impede on sex. Thirdly, we'll examine the negative impacts of limited sex ed. Limited sexual education can lead to the perpetuation of rape culture because of the assumed sexual scripts that paint mass-presenting people as always desiring sex and femme-presenting people as in desperate need to be desired. My third unit would discuss consent and sexual expectations. It would incorporate in-depth discussions about consent, painting it as sometimes uncomfortable, sometimes easy, but always necessary. It would highlight the different ways people may say yes, no, or maybe to sex, and work towards shifting sexual expectations from being gendered. McIver, Dawson, and others state, when talking to young people between the ages of 14 and 17, they found that when accounting for sexual consent negotiations, youth drew on sexual scripts that both upheld and troubled a heteronormative binary that places all the responsibility on women and absolves men. The Consent and Sexual Expectations unit would use a communicative model of sex to change sexual expectations which disproportionately impact women and other marginalized communities. The incorporation of these discussions would encourage in-depth dialogues about sex to perpetuate a culture of consent. In class, we examined work by Barker, Gill, and Harvey, who argue that the mediation of intimacy is infused with power, inequality, and resistance. I believe Barker, Gill, and Harvey would support my new curriculum because it builds off of their discussion of how comprehensive sex ed has long been used to create social change, citing feminist and LGBT liberation movements. We learned about the need for intersectional sex ed. By applying the knowledge gained throughout the semester, I was able to develop units that center intersectional identities to create a more inclusive sexual education program. All of the units I'm proposing directly relate back to how power structures ingrain oppression into sexual education. By incorporating sexuality and gender, pleasure and consent, and sexual expectations, U.S. sex ed can be used as a tool for activism. I guess after all that, there's really only one thing left to say. Who's ready to